is definitely cybersecurity. Um, so with that, Tony, welcome. Thank you for moderating this and helping us out on this. And I will pass the baton to you.
Thanks, Josh. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us bright and early on what appears to be a not super sunny day here in the great state of Missouri. I had the pleasure today to moderate some very amazing presenters, which we will go and introduce here in just a few seconds. But I wanted to set the stage really for today, right? Like cybersecurity has become that scary word, right? We see it in the news, we read about it all the time. There's infrastructure and threats. It really came to a head with SolarWinds and updates and patches and all these other terms and words that sometimes I don't even know what they mean, right? But the reality is there are lots of risks. It's important to our country, not just from a national security perspective, but from an energy perspective to an individual perspective, that we really need to be thinking proactively about how we are responding, the things we are doing, maybe programs we are implementing in our businesses, and the things that we are doing on a daily basis, right? So it's a multifaceted approach that continues to grow in importance. So I'm really excited to share some great thoughts from industry leaders here today with everybody in attendance. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our speakers in no particular order. So our very first one is Brian Gant. Brian has a great background in the industry, and I'm sure we'll have opportunities to dive into it, but he is currently an instructor of cybersecurity at Maryville University. He started his career in law enforcement back in 2004 with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. Moved his way over to the Secret Service, and I think I know Brian pretty well, so I think he had a passion for teaching and education and really wanted to get into that space. And Maryville's got a great program where he has an opportunity to impact the young and up-and-coming industry professionals and students. Our next speaker is Phyllis Lee. She is the Senior Director for Controls at the Center for Internet Security. She has 25 years of experience in information assurance. I don't know how that's possible when she's only 27 years old. She's performed vulnerability assessments, virtualization research, worked in security automation. Prior to joining the CIS, she worked at the NSA, our favorite three-letter agency, of course, focusing on the intersection of malware and virtualization, and that included some collaboration with the MIT Lincoln Labs. Our third speaker is Joe Scher. Joe is an amazing individual I've had the opportunity to know over the last several years. He is currently the Executive Director of Professional Education at the McKelvey School of Engineering at Washington University in St. Louis. Wow, that's a long title, by the way. He serves as Director of the school's Cybersecurity Strategic Initiative. He did serve 24 years in the United States Air Force, which culminated as a commander for the Air Force's only combat-coded deployable comms wing. And he retired as a colonel, and then he returned here to St. Louis and has done a great job of providing leadership for the region and driving a lot of stuff here in the St. Louis market in terms of cybersecurity. And last but definitely not least is Jason Vai. He is currently a cybersecurity manager at 1898 & Company. That is a subsidiary of Burns & McDonnell. They are an amazing group here. They do a lot of audit work, so important stuff within the industry. He leads a team of highly skilled technical professionals, easy for me to say, addressing today's cybersecurity threat. His experience traverses multiple disciplines across a variety of critical infrastructure sectors, not limited to defense, energy, which is our main focus today, water, and finance. So thank you to everybody who's joining us as attendees, and thank you to the panelists for joining. So we're going to get this started with a couple moderated questions, and then I encourage everybody who's listening, let's make this as interactive as possible, right? Like I went in person, it's easier for me to moderate something because I'm going to see you, and I want to make sure that you leave today's session with a nugget or two of information that you can go back and do something today or tomorrow, because it is important for you to be responsive to this. So Please ask questions. We'll make sure we incorporate those throughout the panel. But for today's very first question, I think probably the most important, and I'm going to start at the top of who I introduced, and we'll kind of pass it to each person. But for Brian, what are the primary emerging threats that you see today facing the energy industry?
Thanks, Tony. For the energy industry, and my experience with this, as Tony mentioned, is kind of coming from a federal government perspective, working on critical infrastructures, and now looking at it in the educational aspect. And I think it's two or three main things. The biggest thing is that there are an increased number of threat actors actively targeting critical infrastructures or the energy industry. And that could be simply because of the attack surface that utility companies now possess in terms of larger grids than ever before, kind of the reliance on both physical facilities that we need to protect, as well as kind of cyber related facilities. And so that kind of creates this bubble in which threat actors, whether it be domestic or international, are finding loopholes and vulnerabilities. And these are some of the same threat actors that have attacked the financial industry or healthcare for years. And they're seeing a prime opportunity to go after the energy sector for some of those same reasons.
I'll ask the same question to you, Phyllis. Anything to add for Brian?
No, I mean, I agree. I think we see the energy sector being targeted more and more. I think we see the energy sector also being prone, especially as IT and OT merge, to ransomware, as well as, supply chain. No one is immune to something like a SolarWinds. And so, the energy sector, more and more, you're going to see these kind of mainstream threats. That energy sector perhaps was protected against because there was this physical separation. We're seeing those actually penetrating the sector more and more. Hey, Tony, you're on mute.
Good call. It's hard for me to talk if I'm on mute. You would think a year and a half into COVID that you would know to unmute and mute this at this point, but clearly we're still learning. I would like to ask Joe if there's anything you would like to add for that, because I think this is the meat and potatoes, right? That's going to set the stage for the rest of the discussion.
Yeah, I'm still learning too, obviously. I was on mute there for a second. So totally agree with what Brian and Phyllis have said. The increased number of threats and threat actors targeting utilities, nation states, cyber criminals, hacktivists. And then Brian also mentioned the attack surface, and Phyllis touched on the merging of operational technology, the technology that controls the generation distribution of power. And I want to focus on that a little bit because it's the cyber physical aspect of the utility industry that is very vulnerable, in my opinion, and especially since operational technology, rather than IT, the systems that you normally use in the course of a day on your job, OT was never designed for security, so it makes it especially vulnerable to attack and exploitation. So a lot of challenges, and it's going to take a very concerted and deliberate effort to overcome these.
And last but definitely again not least, Mr. Jason, anything to add for that?
Absolutely. Just to kind of build on specifically what Phyllis said, the convergence of the IT and the OT infrastructure, and then building kind of on what Joseph said. OT obviously was not designed to support security, but the IT infrastructure very well the technology's there, the capabilities are there, not always implemented correctly, but when you start converging those technologies together, you start to bridge those gaps. So those attack vectors become more prevalent to the OT infrastructure. And one of the challenges I see right now is it's this connectivity. Everything is being more connected. And so you hear about Internet of Things. So everything's getting connected to the internet, connected to some type of network. These IoT devices aren't necessarily designed with security in mind. When you look at the energy sector or just IoT in general, it's all about making sure that the devices function. And it's not necessarily looking at it from a security perspective. And that's one of the challenges I see is there's this battle between functionality and security, and nobody's really looking at, can I build something that functions securely, combining the two together. And it really starts with designing the functionality with security in mind from the very beginning. But, it's in this market of high speed, high paced market, it's all about who's getting to the market first. Well, security will slow you down from the design perspective because you have to incorporate a lot of different capabilities in it and things that just take time to actually develop. So when you go with that and you start doing this interconnection, that goes to the purpose or to the area of where those attack vectors, where devices are actually vulnerable to attack. The other challenge that I see too is there's a lot of investment into sustainable energy going forward. A lot of money thrown into it right now. But when you look at the money that's allocated for security and the development of that, the difference in money in the investment is not there. It's more about the capabilities, and there's not an equal amount or an equivalent amount looking at it from a security perspective. So going forward, I think that's one of the biggest challenges is if we're as an industry, as the companies that develop these technologies, if they're not thinking about the security from the very beginning, we're just going to continue to see this challenge going forward into the future.
Yeah, so that was a great segue because my next question was centered around IoT, right? And I look at, organizations that have, plants or facilities all across the state. And I imagine there's a desire to become more efficient, right? If there's that many houses in Wentzville and I have all these meters to check, what are quicker, faster ways for me to do that? And there's, we're starting to find a greater dependence on virtual reality. We're finding greater dependence on artificial intelligence to really help automate some of those processes. What risk do you think organizations that are looking at those things should take into consideration as they're looking to purchase a product? And since Jason, you kind of jumped in the IoT pool first, I'm going to pass that question to you.
Sure. So yeah, kind of going what I said before, it's one thing to look at from a functional perspective, but it is asking those questions about it from a security perspective. So for instance, as an example, in the IT world, devices that are connected to the network actually have the ability to authenticate other devices, authorize those devices. So it's basically you're validating the communications between devices on that IT side. Look at it on the OT side, devices are not designed to do that. But those are the types of questions that I would be asking of any of the vendors that I'm considering purchasing technology from is, help me understand how your device is secure. Can it identify itself on a network? Can it authenticate itself? Can it authenticate other devices that are trying to communicate? So don't just accept the input simply because it's coming from a so-called trusted device because it's on the network. You have to look at it from the perspective of that the device was compromised and that the data that you're sending me, I can't trust until I validate it. So you need to be able to ask those types of tough questions to the vendors. And I do believe that it starts with the acquisition phase. Any company that's acquiring or considering the acquisition of these devices, if you start asking those questions, it will start driving the manufacturers to address that. they're not going to address it until the industry starts demanding it. You can throw regulations out all day long and say that from a regulatory standpoint, it has to be done. But really, it starts with the industry asking for these devices to be able to do things like authenticate, validate the data. Encryption is another big thing within an OT infrastructure, incorporating that capability. But if nobody's asking for it, then the vendors out there, the ones developing these devices, aren't going to do it.
Absolutely. I'm going to kind of just change the question a little bit. So, and we'll, you know, because one of the questions that I think is important in this is really centered around, you know, residential versus, you know, large users, right? Corporate versus residential. You know, what things, and I'll pass this to Phyllis, what things should I as a company or energy provider be thinking about how I am protecting both a large user and a residential user of energy?
Right, that's a great question. So I would say if you look at the kind of attacks that are out there, like ransomware, supply chain attacks, and you look at how organizations are being exploited, you'll see it's because they weren't patching or poor configuration. And what that really says is, you know, we really need to get back to the basics. I know it's very boring. People want to think, what's that silver bullet? What's the tooling we need to buy? It's not that you don't need tools, but we really need to, you know, do those basic cyber hygiene type things. We need to count our assets. And like Jason said, you know, with IoT, that makes it very difficult. You know, what hardware assets are on the network? What software assets are on the network? Are they patched? Are they up to date? And follow that sensitive data. Where is that data that you need to protect, regardless of if it's residential or not? And, you know, apply those protections where you need to. You need to protect those assets. And then, of course, you really need to have a recovery plan in case something happens. So these really are, they kind of seem common sense in those back to basics, but I will tell you, of all the, you know, every organization that I've worked with, from a Fortune 100 to a small medium, the number one hardest things to do are that, you know, hardware and software asset management. But it is so important to understand what's on the network and what software you're running, and to make sure that everything is patched and up to date, which I know for OT is harder. But it's something that we all need to work towards if we really want to try to protect ourselves from these emerging threats.
So there was a great question that actually that ties into that last question really well. So Nicholas asked, you know, there's a large focus around the smart grid, right? Like, we want to make it smart, we want to make it more convenient. The most visible of, you know, inconvenience of a smart grid is really smart meters, you know, which then are now connected to the internet. Do you feel, and I'll ask Brian this question, do you feel that the smart meters are the source of the risk, or devices like thermostats and things that individual users are connecting to the network that may have an opportunity to cross-populate with a smart meter? Which do you feel would have a greater risk, in a company product or an individual user product?
Honestly, I think both, right? I think if that particular product has an IP address and it's an IoT device and it's connected to the network, it's a risk, right? So again, understanding where your keys to the kingdom are, where your sensitive data lies, how much of the sensitive data you have, and kind of like what Phyllis said, just getting back to the basics of having a plan, having a vulnerability management plan. So many organizations go through this in terms of having, you know, these $1 million tools to find different vulnerabilities and critically assess, you know, whether or not they're being exploited in the wild, to rank them, and then, you know, you create tickets and you send them out to your teams to patch whatever needs to be done. The problem with that is, you know, a lot of that patching isn't getting done, and that can be because of skill in terms of understanding what needs to be applied. Can be a manpower issue as well for a lot of the utility companies out there. So I think holistically, just having a plan and then understanding, like I said, where the keys to the kingdom lies, will ultimately help you assess, whether or not that smart meter or that, residential thermostat, where it ranks in your hierarchy of issues or problems.
So, we've probably all participated, right? There's been some corporate, I work for a large organization, small organization. I'm getting cybersecurity training, right? I'm learning what emails not to click and, how to do my patches and mitigate some of that stuff. Has anybody on the panel seen an energy company that has taken that approach for their customers, right? So like, I'm going to ballpark and make up a random number just because that's what I like to do. So 25% of home users have registered their router at home, actually changed the password from admin password, and like added some home security to their home router, right? Like there's a small percentage, and then you sprinkle in actually updating patches to their own router and system. Would you feel that there would be value for energy companies to take and invest some time and maybe some money into their customers for cybersecurity education of things that they could do to help protect them? Like that, do you think that would be valuable? And I'm throwing that at anybody who wants to jump in on that. Would there be value in that? Energy companies educating customers on risks of things that they can help them protect?
I think there's value in it, but I think there would probably be more value and in the company as a whole itself internally, educating employees, executives, shoring up the network. I think there would be more value there, personally. But that's just my opinion on that.
Yeah, I agree with Brian. I think that as a user, I personally, am pretty lazy at home. I mean, we do our due diligence with our routers, et cetera, et cetera. But I think that, security is something that I do. I think another duty as assigned, as we say, for the home user, I think could be a big lift. So it is important for energy companies to implement, basic cyber hygiene across the board, getting back to the basics, and trying to protect on behalf of their users. I think we all know that getting users to implement cybersecurity within their own home networks is very difficult. Even at work, when we try to do our phishing campaigns, et cetera, there's always folks who want free yoga, you know what I mean? Like, even though you've had all this mandatory training, they're clicking on those. So I think it would be hard, large scale, to try to do that. It's not harmful, but I think to count on that would be very difficult.
Yeah, good answers. I was just curious as a consumer, and I think of our most targeted population for those type of phishing campaigns are elderly, because they seem to be easy targets between phone numbers and calls, and let me access your computer and those type of things where, there are inherent implied risk of those folks doing that. There was another question that came in that there is an increase in GPS subsurface mapping. Is there a greater risk to this as GPS is easily hackable? I see Joe nodding his head.
Yeah, I can take that one. Really interesting question. So, and I'm going to break this into two parts. So you have the GPS satellite network itself that is run by the U.S. Space Force. It would take a very sophisticated nation-state level capability to compromise the satellite-based GPS network. Where the real threat comes is the devices that access GPS signals. So the GPS subsurface mapping device you may use, it could be hacked. But the way to protect against it is, number one, to evaluate the security of the devices that you intend to use before you purchase them, to put them through some sort of testing process, or be assured that the device has the appropriate security protections built into it. And then the second thing is to ensure that you're using the device properly, obviously, and then that there's periodic assessments done on the security of the network. But I would say, but overall, I think the threat, like if I were an opportunistic cyber cartel, cybercrime cartel, or a nation state, I would probably not attack the devices. I would attack the machines that actually produce the electricity, and then the transformers and the distribution network to actually compromise delivery of power. So it's, the nation states and cyber criminals, they go through a decision-making process on, okay, what do I want to achieve? Cyber criminals are going to go for the biggest bang for the buck, whatever's easiest to get the most value out of the information that they're stealing. A nation state obviously is going to try to inflict harm, damage, destruction in some form or fashion. So you have to take into account the threat. And so I think for GPS subsurface mapping, I think overall the risk there is probably low. And I'm happy to hear from the panel if they think I'm a little off base. But
so real quick, there was a question of clarification of a word being used. So I want to make sure we address that to help kind of drive things forward. So the question was, what is OT? And I would say in a layman's term that somebody, if this isn't their jam, how would they interpret OT in terms of how you're using it?
Yeah, I'll take that too. So operational technology is the technology that's actually used in the energy industry. It would be related to those electronic or hardware-based devices that are used in the generation, control, and distribution of electricity. Information technology are those administrative systems that are used on the corporate side for email or HR or things of that nature. The issue is that IT and OT are starting to become more and more connected. So internet connected, put it that way. I hope that helps.
Yeah, I think it's always just, it's easy. We say the words and sometimes we got to make sure that we're translating that. So, and it's helpful for me too. Anybody wanted to piggyback on the question prior around the GPS stuff? Anybody have anything to add? If not, we can jump to another question. That's a good, there's, I'm always blown away. Geospatial is the buzz in St. Louis right now, right? Like everything is geospatial. And
since you're kind of going down that path there, Tony, I agree with Joseph as far as like the GPS definitely has vulnerabilities. There's two different channels that it basically works on overall, and the legacy channel that is no longer used is extremely vulnerable. But to his point about nation states actually doing something with the GPS satellites, not likely, simply because they are dependent on it as well. When you look at globally, they utilize the US-based GPS system. So if you take that down, then your whole systems can't work. Now, that's not to say that our adversaries aren't developing their own satellite-based GPS systems. They are doing that. So then ours become vulnerable. But as of right now, ours, the US's GPS satellite system is predominantly used throughout the world. So
good feedback. I'm still amazed at how often we all unknowingly use geospatial technology and satellites and GPS, right? From a map to Waze to Google Maps, and then just the amount of data that drives the geospatial data provides, right? From gas stations to subways to all those things. I'm continually blown away to learn. So we've got lots of questions coming in, which is awesome for us. It means we're facilitating some good discussion. So one question from Ginny Bretbird was, what should policymakers be thinking to prevent cyber attacks? Can regulation keep up, or is more investment in cybersecurity research training needed? I see Phyllis came off mute.
So I'll go ahead and say a few words. So, we at CIS, we do monitor the regulations, et cetera, and see the laws that are and executive orders that are coming down the pike. I think as someone on the panel already said, regulatory frameworks do not necessarily mean security, right? And so what we have found with many organizations, and I'm going to kind of drive home the back to basics, is that it's really intimidating for many organizations to say, okay, I'm going to implement, for example, the NIST cybersecurity framework CSF in total. What does that really mean? How do I implement it? What does it mean to satisfy it? And so we find that many organizations, or like CMMC that's just recently been put out, are having issues understanding what it means to implement. And then of course you have this huge catalog of controls that you somehow have to satisfy. Everyone has limited budgets. Everyone does have limited staff. So what I think would be better is to say, okay, let's get back to basics. Do these things first, right? That's the power of the controls. I'll do a little plug for those. It does have a prioritization. When you look at the other regulatory frameworks, everything is important, everything has to be done, and everything has to be done well. I think what's important is for policymakers to understand that organizations cannot implement everything in total. And what's the prioritization? What needs to be done first? What really is basic cyber hygiene? You see that a lot. We've defined it for you at CIS, but whatever organization you're in, you really need to have that on-ramp onto that controls framework. I do believe also that training is important. There is a total lack of cybersecurity training across the board in the US. There are many organizations working, trying to fill that gap. I just was on a call with Salesforce yesterday. They have a lot of free online training for organizations or individuals to take. So I think it is twofold to provide that training, starting at the college level. And Joe can tell us more about, we need to help people get into the workforce, right off the bat with cyber, so they can contribute and understand really what is going on, what are these threats, how is it that we can implement safeguards or controls across our network.
I think Brian had a little bit more he wanted to add to the TTX question.
Yeah, and in regards to the tabletop question, I'm going to do a little plug here for one of our presenters who was unable to make it, but CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is basically, the federal arm for cybersecurity in the federal government. They do a wonderful job at helping organizations, both educational, private, nonprofit, in terms of helping them out with tabletop exercises. So you literally can contact your, regional advisor for your area, your CISA representative. You basically create a plan, a 3, 4, 5 month plan. You go through a template and kind of go through your network and things that you want to protect. Maybe some goals that you have in terms of collaboration with other teams and kind of what you want that final deliverable or the output to look like. And CISA will actually come in and kind of moderate the tabletop exercise, and you pick the particular stakeholders that you want involved, with that particular process. And I can definitely say that I've participated in that process in private industry, and it's definitely worthwhile. It allows you to test out those incident response plans and test out some of the teams that you have in place in regards to threats that you may have to your particular utility company or to your particular sector. And over time, you just develop and you create a security culture, and you increase awareness in your organization about your particular plan. So hopefully that answers that tabletop question.
Hearing tabletop exercise always gives me flashbacks to the military and just planning and scenarioing all the different things. And the idea is really simulating an incident timing your responses and seeing what, and really building out systems and process and plans that you would do in response to whatever it may be. And then like, I know I've worked with some of the WashU students and thinking through some of their incident response plans, and they could get, something as simple as a phone tree, right? A breach happens, especially in a remote world. How does all of that information distribute to a company of 1,000 people? Like those are things to really think through at a tabletop exercise is really helpful. We've got one more question here. I'm gonna table it because Phyllis, I'll get back to it, I promise. But Phyllis had kind of dropped a point around workforce and just the importance of growing talent right into it. And so I'm gonna soapbox for 3 seconds, if it's all right. We've all heard this idea of a skills gap, right? We need people with skills. We need skills. I will tell you with 100% certainty, the United States has done a phenomenal job of responding to skills gap, right? Our state, and specifically, has great community colleges, 4-year programs, master programs, boot camps, and apprenticeships that are designed to give people the skills that they would need to get into a cybersecurity career, right? Which is awesome. What we really need to dive into in this is helping companies think creatively of how they take students from Maryville, how they take students from WashU, because what we're seeing on our end, just from a cyber up perspective, is that I do all the things, I get all the skills. It's still really, really hard for me to get that first job, right? It takes some time to get into it, but once I'm in, I'm in. So, but I think thinking creatively of how you're hiring people, how you're incorporating them into your infrastructure. It doesn't take away that everybody needs somebody with 5-7 years of experience who's driving tabletop exercises and strategy and like finding products, but how do you really grow your workforce to be responsive? So with that being said, I want to make sure, to what extent do you think companies should be doing to grow a cybersecurity team of their own? Or what would you recommend for an organization who's like, man, I'm hearing all these things of CMMC and NIST and all these frameworks. What should I be doing to grow my team internally, to be responsive to those things, today and into the future?
I can address that one initially. So I think organizations need to recognize that cybersecurity is no longer one individual's or one department's responsibility. I do believe that there needs to be that subject matter expert within an organization, but it really, it's one of those things that all the employees really need to embrace cybersecurity and address it and be mindful of it just in their day-to-day work. Specifically around like the subject matter expert, finding that subject matter expert is going to be key from a technical perspective, from a visionary perspective, things like that. But then your leadership also needs to be fully supportive of it, because there's no finish line to cybersecurity. It's not like you spend $1 million today and then you're done. It's an ongoing thing. Needs to be continuously budgeted year after year after year, and it's not going to end, and it'll probably increase. So one, having the proper leadership that recognizes the importance of it is going to be key. Having that subject matter expert that can be tapped into as far as strategy, direction, things like that is going to be key. Finding the rest of the team, that is a challenge because we know that that there's more cybersecurity jobs out there than there are talent. So that kind of goes to the education thing. I'll let Joseph talk a little bit about that, but also it's finding, one thing to recognize too is the subject matter experts don't necessarily need to be your own employees. Looking for the partnerships. I know that in this space, there's a lot of competition, things like that. And there's a time for competition, and then there's a time for teamwork across an industry. So having conversations like this where we can all get together, we all have our different objectives and all that stuff, but sharing the information, sharing the knowledge. Cybersecurity should not be, I'm one of those people that although there's money to be made in cybersecurity, also I sit there and look at it and say, we need to do the right thing. So we need to understand the balance between sharing the information, helping each other out, across the industry, and then, you know, making a dime off of it, you know, sort of thing. But kind of going to the education thing too, it's at the university level as well. You know, we need to entice the younger generation to look into, you know, those STEM programs. The education programs need to be continuously beefed up and changed, and as threats change, as technology changes, we need to keep up with that.
Anybody like to go ahead, Joe?
Yeah, just a couple small points. So as far as depending on the size of your utility company, some of the larger companies may be able to, you know, build out their own staff or convert, you know, engineers, a lot of electrical engineers and computer scientists, maybe over into a cybersecurity office. But at minimum, no matter what level you're at, you need to have someone internal that's somewhat expert in cybersecurity management and governance to be able to set up policies and procedures for the company itself. So, and then to Jason's point, depending on, you know, your size, you may be able to outsource the other talent to bring that in. The other thing I would say is it's important to develop your talent internally, to continually seek to upskill them, which is part of the overall investment to mitigate the cybersecurity risk. Is, you know, your team is absolutely critical. That's a key part of the equation.
Tony, I just want to echo something that Jason said, and I definitely want to underscore it, is that industry-wide collaboration. So like you said, competition, right? You know, whether it be in the energy sector or healthcare or what have you. I have seen where when you collaborate industry-wide, let's say with another competing hospital system or what have you, or you get in that particular group and you start having proof of concept meetings to vet vendors together instead of independently. You start creating a security culture for your particular group, and it kind of has a domino effect, you know, and you might get a product that, you know, might cost $1 million if you were to get it independently, whereas as a group, you might be getting it for $400,000 or $500,000. And so as Jason talked about, that continuous budget that you're going to have to build over time, you have to start thinking smarter as an organization. And that starts from the top on down on how you can, you know, get the biggest bang for the buck, right? So the industry-wide collaboration, I think, is very key.
So I think just from, so the hard part is, and it's been kind of alluded to a little bit, is really how do you get buy-in from executive leadership? How do you convince that it is important? And it's really hard for that, you know, to build out the business case without having a known start point. So I'm not paid by 1898, right? But my suggestion, and we alluded to some of the frameworks of NIST or CMMC, start with a moment in time audit, see where you're at, see where your vulnerabilities are at. I particularly like the NIST framework because it breaks it down in just a couple different levels where you're able to say level 1, I'm assuming this risk, level 2, I'm assuming this risk, and level 3, I'm assuming this, right? And level 3 means you know, nobody's perfect, but you're pretty close to perfect. And by breaking it down that way, you can add a cost of what it would be to be at that level. And then you're going to know what risk that you would be taking. So, you know, that would be, you know, just my kind of nickel's worth of suggestion. If you're not sure where you're currently standing, find an organization, do an audit, really have a solid plan in place for current, you know, in the next 3 to 5 years of how you plan to scale and grow it, and then becoming compliant with your federal regulations. And I, you know, just to also add, you know, the financial services does a really good job of doing what Brian is alluding to around just cross industry or cross, you know, company pollination of information within their ISAC. So an information sharing analysis. I always forget what the C is. But those are what is ISAC? I find it
Information Sharing and Analysis Center.
There you go. But those are great opportunities where those are industries that have collectively come together to do what Brian is saying, like, hey, like they're all similar approaches, right? If you think of healthcare, and they've all got the same machines, they've all got the same stuff in, so there's the same type of risk they're all taking. So finding that cross-pollination is great. So a question from Paul Englert from Spire was, drones are becoming more prevalent in the utility industry, which is cool to see, right? Everybody loves a drone, they're awesome. What potential risk do you see drones posing for companies?
Yeah, I've got a couple of thoughts on this. So putting my, given my Air Force background, but really there's less of a cybersecurity threat here and more of an airspace threat. It's important, especially if utility companies are going to start to fly drones, to make sure that you're in compliance with FAA regulations, you have certified operators, that type of thing, and that you really do an airspace study of all your sites. This is approaches to the sites, and to make sure that's well understood between the FAA and you and within your company. As far as the drones being a threat to the utility industry, we haven't seen it yet, but I know the Department of Defense is looking at drones as one of the emerging threats, especially as they get smaller and smaller. They may be able to carry small payloads, bombs, that kind of thing. The other issue is surveillance. If you're a nation state actor, you could probably get by without using drones to map an energy infrastructure. There's a lot of other ways to do it. If there's there could be a terrorist threat, that type of thing, some surveillance. So, putting in a policy for drone awareness. If there's a drone flying over one of your, say, your power plants, that your employees or maybe the residents around the site will report it. It's that type of thing. So overall, especially in the United States, those the drones threat, I think, is low, but it is prudent, I think, for a company to put a few cycles, a little energy into putting together a program, especially if you're going to be operating drones. So and I'll defer to my other panel members on the cybersecurity piece, but I really don't see a lot there, in my opinion.
Yeah, just to kind of build on that, to your point, as of right now, that threat definitely is lower, but it's definitely emerging. One of the things I look at is, you look at like drones being used to inspect transmission lines, and to your point, Joseph, they can and will start carrying payloads. So one of the challenges, I think, for organizations, if you're using them, is how do you tell that drone is yours, right? Let's say you have a fleet of 10 or 15 drones. How are you going to tell one's apart from another that it's yours, that it's out there for a legitimate reason versus something else? And when you start talking about like payloads and we're seeing organizations starting to switch from traditional radio networks to LTE networks, things like that. I don't necessarily, I could use the drone to essentially intercept traffic, change that traffic, and report something different. If I'm out there trying to monitor, a reader on one end, so I can play that man in the middle attack from an aerial perspective. Now I don't need a drone for that, but a drone could be used for that sort of thing, to make it a little bit easier to actually get in line with microwave channels or whatever it may be. So I could do that. A little challenging, but not necessarily far-fetched. And I don't have to send out a person. You send out a person into walking around a facility and stuff like that, it draws attention. But if I know you're using drones and I use the same sort of thing, and there you go. So I'm basically infiltrating your environment without you really knowing. A little further down the road, I think, but those are the types of things I think organizations and specifically the government is looking at.
I mean, I have a nerdy friend who took a drone, attached a Wi-Fi pineapple, and then as a product. And for those that don't know, Wi-Fi pineapple serves as kind of a traffic aggregator that can pull people's get access to your computers. It broadcasts to Wi-Fi signal. Your computer's programmed to store said Wi-Fi signals, and it replicates that thing, and then it connects your device to that. So, that's just a guy who I would call a quirky hacker who made a small Wi-Fi, made a small drone, attached a thing to it, powered it with some USB, and flew, right? Which in theory could go across and have some of those channels being broadcasted. So there was a question that was presented by the attendees, but I'm going to segue it real quick with another question because I think they tie in really, really well. Are you guys seeing any federal regulations? And this probably might be a question for Phyllis. Federal regulations or guidelines that are coming down, and what do you see the impact of those being?
I have not noticed anything for energy. The latest and greatest, of course, is CMMC. What so you see the US federal government being concerned about supply chain. What is it that we're doing about the supply chain? And having actual, the primary contractor, being responsible for the supply chain, right? So, CMMC is saying, okay, you, the primary, now you're responsible for, the following, your suppliers, right? Which is an impossible task for many organizations. They may have tens of thousands. I mean, what does it take to build a plane or a carrier, an aircraft carrier, right? I mean, that of course is a DoD regulation, but that may bleed over into other things, right? All it takes is an incident, and then you see the lawmakers, go into action. At this point, we have been monitoring for some cybersecurity legislation. We don't see too much agreement amongst the different parties on that, but at this point, we have not seen too much. What we have seen, though, I will tell you, at the state level, we have seen more legislation at the state level. And in particular, what we follow is around the controls. So the state of Connecticut recently implemented a safe harbor law around the critical security controls, the CIS controls, and NIST CSF. Nevada put out some legislation around the CIS controls, implementing them via the implementation groups, our prioritization, as well as NIST CSF. And so what we're seeing is some safe harbor laws, as well as implementing cybersecurity frameworks at the state level. We've seen more and more of that happening, which I think is interesting, versus at the federal level.
And for those that are saying, what is CMMC? That is the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification. It is federal regulation that's being pushed down to manufacturers and companies who do business with the federal government, that they're asking you to increase your level of security. I think that the concerns I'm hearing from individuals is really the absoluteness of it, right? Where it's a pass fail. You do all this work and you fail, and then you're in trouble, and then you've got to revamp and reset and then schedule 6 months out. And it's, COVID, I think, has pushed back some of the dates and deadlines for people to be CMMC compliant, but it is something that should be on your radar to be looking at blocking and tackling.
Yeah, it is a big deal. It's a big federal program. If you are familiar with the NIST 800-171 around supply chain, the DoD kind of took that and morphed it into CMMC, which, potentially, which will affect hundreds and thousands of organizations will be subject to that.
Yeah, the little small manufacturers who make a specific part for Boeing has an impact on CMMC. So it does have a major trickle down effect. So then the question that came in from the audience centered around regulatory stuff, right? An incident happens, there's an oh crap moment, and everybody points fingers. Who's at fault, right? It's your fault, it's my fault. And nobody wants to be that person. I still have a tremendous amount of sympathy for every CISO of every organization, because you're the fall person. And that's a really, really hard, stressful job. But what recommendations based off of, I have an incident, state regulators come in, they're imposing their measures on me. What would you recommend for regulators to balance jurisdictional, easy for me to say, issues, federal guidelines or standards or state, and how to balance adequate protocols to ensure performance against attacks while also not authorizing a blank check to utilities that would perpetuate so-called gold plating. Does that question make sense? We'll make sure I read it as it came in, but I wanted to make sure that it's clear as mud. How can we get companies and regulators to work better together, to not be so pointy fingery at each other when something happens? Those are very technical terms and big brain terms.
I think I kind of understand where you're going with the question. So obviously getting industry and regulators to work together, right? So one, I think on the regulation side, we all need to start speaking the same language. Years ago, every different industry had their own set of requirements, security requirements, things like that. Now NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, has been around for decades. And from the very time that it started, it was all based on solid recommendations. They spent a lot of time doing studies, put together recommendations, and it's always been recommendations up until a couple of years ago. What you're starting to see is the adoption of that framework across industries. And I think that's going to be a key point to continue to move in that direction, because at least it gets us to the point where we're all talking the same language. I'll use an example, the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, NERC. So some of these larger energy companies need to follow NERC SIP compliance, be all that sort of, and be compliant with that. The interesting thing is when you look at that framework, the classes that are taught and the people that are very knowledgeable of it, when you go out and do an assessment in compliance with like NERC SIP, it's all about categorizing your system in a way that makes sure that you don't have to meet that requirement. Okay, it's like trying to avoid having the regulation over certain types of systems. That's probably not the best approach. So what you're seeing is, at least there's talk about where NERC is going to start transitioning into utilizing the NIST cybersecurity framework, which changes the whole model. It is more of a risk-based approach. So you're not purposely trying to avoid doing things that we should be doing. Like, we should be doing the right thing. And I think moving into that direction is going to help organizations do the right thing without the fear of fines, because NERC, there's fines associated with it. I'm not saying that you're going to get away with no fines whatsoever, but at least let's move into the direction where it's not a fear-based system and it's more of a risk-based approach. By following that, you can have the proper conversations with the regulators and all that stuff to say, okay, so I can focus on cybersecurity around the things that are most risk to either the organization or to the infrastructure or to the industry itself. So I think moving in that direction, it gets us all talking on the same page. Those are the types of things that I think we need to start seeing. And I know that those conversations are happening at that regulatory level. But it's continuing the collaboration between industry and regulators is going to help.
I would just also say, I mean, aftermath of an incident is I think emotions are high and people do tend to point fingers. We hope that, obviously I'm coming from the controls perspective, prior to that, organizations really do have that incident response plan. You know, I sat in a talk by someone on the board of Target, and she was like, you know, number one, it was preventable. It was reported up, so that there is an issue there within Target. But you know, they had never done a tabletop exercise. They had no idea what to do when the incident happened. There are so many frameworks that say have an incident response plan, right? You know, I think almost every framework has that. Our framework has that. We try to be a little more prescriptive, but I think perhaps maybe there should be, you know, hey, this is what needs to be in your incident response plan. We need to know who to call. Someone has to have, you know, roles need to be defined within the organization. Are those roles there? Are those phone numbers up to date? Do you call law enforcement? Do you call the federal space? Do you have to call the state? I mean, organizations need to figure this out and put those in an incident response plan, I believe Ryan talked about doing a tabletop exercise. Perhaps that would be helpful, to understand who really needs to do what and what needs to happen. A big company like Target had no idea. And they certainly had the resources to do something like that, but that was not their focus. Their focus is making money. We hear it so often, transportation, their focus is uptime. Same thing with, I'm sure, energy, uptime, people get upset when they don't have power, all these things. And so it really is trying to prioritize, what to do if you are subject or a victim of a cybersecurity attack, and being prepared. I think that also helps once you actually have a plan in place.
So there was, in 2020, there was $123 billion spent on this very subject, right? Like, that's a lot of money, which that's based on services, that's based on products. Like, I'm not a hiring manager. I'm a IT leader. I know I should be doing something in this, right? I'm inundated with the next best tool that's going to solve all my problems, whether it's phishing campaigns or it's a tool that's going to protect my network. What should I be thinking about when I'm getting inundated with these salespeople trying to sell me the next best thing? Like, what should I be in consideration of prior to making a $123 billion investment into something?
Yeah, be cautious about anybody that's calling up and selling something. So it's interesting because throughout my career, I've been in that situation where every sales guy shows up on your doorstep trying to sell you the latest, greatest product. And then at the end of the day, you have, 50 products, they're half implemented. You're not leveraging all the capabilities and you're still talking about gaps. So it comes down to the balance between the people, processes, and technology. It's not all about technology. You do have to have a strategy behind it. Salespeople, these companies that develop the cybersecurity tools, they develop some great stuff. There's no question about it. But they're all about trying to sell products. So you got to be mindful of that. And going back to what you said earlier, doing an assessment today to find out where you currently are, basically getting your bearings, is so important. And it's not about assessing just the technology. It is assessing the people, the processes, and the technology. So what is your strategy? What is your culture? What is your budget, sort of thing? You got to look at it that from the people perspective, and then obviously how you implement your security and then your technology. So starting with that will help you navigate the continuous calls and being inundated by technology. Because if you have the assessment, it's not to say that technology is not going to play a part of it. Again, it's people, processes, and technology. I need to be able to balance things across that. So not looking at the technology as to be, the end all be all. It's how I'm going to use it. Is it really addressing what my true risks are today? Because I've seen it when we've gone out and done assessments, done plenty of these things. And you start talking about the challenges that an organization faces, and I'm not kidding, you can physically see it in their eyes and in their body, that kind of like, oh damn moment, and they realize, and they quickly get overwhelmed with how bad things potentially are, that you don't know where to begin. And so you end up setting it off to the side. It's realizing, again, going back to what I said earlier, is there is no finish line. It's one step at a time. And recognizing that, putting together a good strategy helps you navigate that technology perspective. Because I will tell you that in all the cases I've been out, the organizations actually have more capability with what they currently have today if they just refocused how they use those tools, how they use the systems. There is a lot of capability. They're just not aware of the capabilities. It's basically like using a tool for something else, right? You don't have a hammer, so you grab the biggest screwdriver and you hammer in a nail, right? Looking at the tools that you have and using them in different ways that actually help you from a cyber perspective. I've seen it. many times, every time I go out, it's you can use this tool for this way if you just look at it from a different perspective. So it's not all about getting the new technologies.
The dark web is scary. I want to know if they're talking about me in the dark web. And this company said that they can predict a response in 12 hours. Like, shouldn't I buy this? It's required. And I say that in jest. I'm not. There's been so many products and tools and things that I'm acknowledging that, like, it's really, really hard as an organization to understand which one of those is actually needed for me and which one I should be focusing my time on. So it was a way to stomp my foot and really say, have a known start point, really look where you're at. And that would be my advice for most companies.
One thing to kind of just jump on, Tony, real quick there is one, there's no technology that's going to solve all your challenges, your problems. So be mindful of that, because usually it's going to be a handful of tools that you need, and those tools need to work together in one seamless overarching technical capability. So that's one thing to be careful of too, is no technology is going to solve all your problems. It's usually going to be multiple solutions, which means that all those solutions need to work together. And not all the products out there on the street will work together.
I want to foot stomp what Jason says. I mean, I came from the DoD. I don't know how many dashboards people have to look at, different dashboards from the different tools to figure out what's on my network. Is it patched? Is it up to date? Right. And just those basic questions. And of course, all these, all these other fancy tools. I agree with everybody. And I just want to foot stomp, find your baseline. Go back to the basics. Application whitelisting, if you were to line it up on how it plays against all these different attack vectors, it will rank high. However, it's very difficult to implement. And if you don't have the basics down, if you don't know what's on your network, if you don't know what software is on your network, what version you're running of that hardware and software, you don't know, who needs access to what and what where your sensitive data is and how you want to protect it, your application whitelisting tooling is not going to help you. And so really think about, like Tony and what Jason is saying, like assess where you are and be realistic about your plan. Do a crawl, walk, run. Implement basic cyber hygiene first, do the basics, then build upon that. Make sure you're patching, make sure you have good configuration, etc. Thanks.
And Tony, it kind of goes back to that, that pipeline of individuals, whether coming out of education or apprenticeships, having the skills to do proof of concepts. I'm a big proof of concept guy, right? So when those vendors come to you, take your time, do your due diligence. Don't try to do a proof of concept in a couple of weeks in your production environment and decide then whether or not this particular tool will be of some use for you. Take some time and do like Phyllis says and get a proper baseline of whatever you're trying to protect. And then you can truly, decide. And you can look at other agencies like Gartner as an example is used heavily in terms of giving recommendations toward, particular vendors in the security space. So just do your due diligence.
So staying in line with products. And there's a couple other questions here that I want to make sure we can try to get to. We got 15 minutes. So if you have questions, please come in and continue to ask. But in line with products, there's been this surge of the concept of cyber insurance, right? It's important. Is that something that I, as a company, and I'm, as an energy company, are those things that I should be looking at to incorporate into my business plan? Is that things I should be requiring vendors to have? What would be your thoughts and recommendations for companies for cyber insurance?
I think it would be very smart for you, especially you kind of brought up the whole the CISO role and how nerve-wracking that position can be. Cyber liability insurance is something that comes into play in every incident. That CISO is going to walk into that operations center and at some point, get legal and other stakeholders involved and ask does he need to invoke it or not? It's kind of a way for them to cover on the back end if exfil has occurred or what have you in that particular incident organization. So we teach it here at my incident response class at Maryville. Cyber liability insurance is something that we feel definitely should be a part of your incident response plan.
So I quickly Googled a data breach cost a company on average of $8.19 million. So having some protection, I know there's various limits that I've learned more about insurance over the last couple of weeks just through my own job. There are various limits, but it's not overly expensive, believe it or not, for 5 million or 10 million of insurance. So, definitely something, and I'm not paid by an insurance company, but it's something that is important for you that gives you some backside protection, for that 8.19 million. Any other thoughts on the insurance piece before I jump into another question? Hearing none, we're going to go into it. So staying in line with teams, staying in line with, and assuming we've brought in an organization, we have an assessment of time and talent and treasure and what we need to do. What would you say an effective cybersecurity team or org would look like for an organization? That's a big question. I get it, but I can paint a more specific scenario around like size and scope. So I am lived at Fort Leonard Wood for 9 years. I am Pulaski County Energy Company. I employ 100 people and I manage 35,000 homes. What would a security team look like for me?
I'll take a cut at it. So I think a team of, this may sound small, but 5 to 7 very highly qualified individuals. And then in the context of the overall IT budget for the company, that at least 10% of that budget is allocated towards cybersecurity funding. I think you're definitely in the ballpark there. And then there's all the things that team needs to be doing, which is a lot. I think if you've got that, decent set of level of expertise and that budget, you're in the game at least.
Yeah, I think in a perfect world, you have a couple of security analysts, incident respond analysts, maybe level 2 or level 1, kind of eyes on glass. You have a threat intelligence specialist or some kind of strategic threat intelligence team to kind of do that proactive looking for the team in terms of IOCs or things that are happening in the energy sector, things that they can give your incident response analysts kind of a heads up on, to look down the line. You have some vulnerability management people, and then possibly maybe even have a pen tester or maybe a third party pen tester, just to kind of shore up some gaps in your internal system in a perfect world.
So I love Ferraris and Lamborghinis. We all like fancy cars, right? Then they're expensive. If I'm looking at this, what we both just described, what's it going to cost me in my best used car sales voice, right? Like what am I going to have to spend as a company to like hit that 5 to 7 people and have some tools? Like, what is the cost? Sell me on it.
I would sell you on the benefits of the investment rather than the cost. But so salary wise, you're probably in for $250,000 to $300,000, and I think tool wise, and infrastructure wise, probably at least that much, maybe a little more. So you're talking high 6 figures, low 7 figures, probably something around there. Jason and Brian and Phyllis may have some additional insights or thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, as far as cost, so the missing component is the benefit analysis. So that cost benefit analysis needs to be performed, because I think it's less about the cost of what it's going to, because that's usually the challenge every time you have a conversation with an executive. It's like, what is it going to cost me? And the conversation needs to be all about this is what I'm preventing you from losing. Okay, so I think that cost is more important to talk about than what it is to actually establish a posture, because again, you can't just throw $1 at it today and say that I'm done. It's going to be an ongoing thing that needs to be budgeted as part of operating as a business. It's just the nature of the beast of where cybersecurity really is. And then going back to what does the team look like? What is that optimal team? Building on what everybody else said without, doubling up on that stuff, because I think you need all that stuff, but you really need that engineer mindset. That's that lead security engineer who's always looking at ways to improve from an architecture design perspective, from a capability perspective, and tweaking that and tweaking that. So the threat landscape evolves constantly. What you do today isn't going to necessarily help you tomorrow. So having that subject matter expert who thinks like that, who thinks like an engineer, probably, and constantly picking out problems, solving those problems one at a time, over and over, never giving up. That it's a characteristics in the individual that you're looking for, and not so much the technical skill set. That's the easy part. Getting the person to be able, finding that person who thinks outside the box, who's always looking for the next challenge, constantly saying, hey, I built this today, it's fantastic, and then come into the office tomorrow and saying, I don't like what I did yesterday, I want to do it different. It's always about process improvement, technical capabilities improvement, things like that. So that subject matter expert who thinks like that is going to be your key individual, because that person's going to be able to convince the executives. It's going to build a team around it of the ones that are doing the monitoring, the response, and all that stuff. But that subject matter expert is that key.
I would totally agree with that, Jason. And I think that the larger point for me is that, if you're in the, utility or energy business, you can't ignore cybersecurity, because it's about mitigating risk to energy delivery, and cybersecurity is a threat to that. So it must be dealt with. A head in the sand approach is not going to work in this day and age. So there is a cost associated with it, but it's the world we live in. It's the bottom line.
And I know we talked a lot about NIST. So NIST has a framework for building out a cybersecurity capability from a personnel perspective. I think it's NIST 800-181, I think, if I remember correctly. Take a look at that, do your evaluations based on that, look at the skill sets that identifies, because that particular standard is all about building out a cybersecurity program. Now it's geared towards the federal space, but it is fully applicable to this environment as well, the energy sector.
Yeah, we had a running joke about implementing new members of the team or new software. It was like, well, what's the quickest way, to get the executives to buy in? It was like have an incident. People are completely reactive, and that's kind of the culture we need to change, in terms of cybersecurity in all sectors.
Yeah, and so I agree with you. I see that across the board, that, I think we're all alluding to it. It is also a cultural shift, right? And so just like IT and OT are merging, there's not that separation. You have your IT team, and then you have your cybersecurity team. They really need to be integrated, and they need to merge as well, right? So it used to be, here's your IT team, here's your, they're doing the sysadmin, here's your network admin team. They kind of do more security, kind of managing the firewalls and the routers, et cetera. But we see that more and more integrated. I sat in a talk and they said, the edge of your network is at your user's fingertips, because, everyone's work from home, et cetera, et cetera. So it really is integrating cyber within, IT as well. It's not just, there's your separate team and we're going to do this overlay of cyber and these controls later. It should be integrated with the way that you do business.
So you're telling me
The takeaway, I do this because I'm passionate about what I do. It's more about helping individuals out, helping organizations out, information sharing. Feel free to reach out to me. Plenty of things that I can help out with. Answer any questions, point you in the right direction, things like that. Like I said, this isn't. I work for an organization, and that's fantastic because we got to pay the bills, but it's not about making money. It's about doing the right thing. So anytime, I do get inundated quite a bit. So I will say that it may take a little bit of time for me to get back to you, but feel free to reach out with any questions, any concerns, any, you know, really anything.
We will go to Brian.
I would say fight the good fight, right? Whether it's with your director or your CISO, fight for security, fight for IT security. Try to get yourself, I think it's one of the panelists mentioned, in those IT architecture meetings or those application development or software development meetings at the beginning, and give security a stake in it, and it will save you a lot of heartache, you know, in the long run on the back end.
Joe?
The threat is real. The threat is growing, and it will continue to grow in the future. So we ignore the threat at our own peril. So jump in there and get started. And you don't need to necessarily have a huge budget to do it. A culture of awareness within the company can go a long, long way.
Last but not least, Phyllis.
So I would say start small. Start with the basics. I'm a big proponent of the crawl, walk, run, basic cyber hygiene. Take that baseline, whether it be implementation group 1 of the CIS controls, if you want to look at NIST CSF or the 171, but start small and do something achievable. Start with those basics, and that will really shore up your defensive program.
Awesome. Well, thank you, panelists, for sharing some great words and wisdom today for all the attendees. Thanks for the opportunity today to spend some time with everybody and have, you know, a well-needed conversation. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of your conference.
Bye. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you all.